When I first stepped into this garage to take measurements, this huge window immediately caught my eye. I don't think I'd ever seen a window this big in a garage before, so I actually loved it. But as much as I enjoyed the natural light, I've come to learn that it can be really difficult for filming. Every time the light changed, my partner would go, "Ugh," or "ah." It was funny at first, but the more it happened, the more I felt we should do something about it. And so, that's how the window cover accessory wall idea came to be. I started this project last year, maybe around July or August, but because our savings were starting to dwindle, the pressure was on to get the shop open. I put it on hold, laid the board against the wall, and shifted my focus to getting things operational. We didn't think about filming everything back then, so we don't have any footage of it. But the good thing is, I didn't complete much. The only things I got done were putting these closet slider wheels on the bottom of the OSB board and setting aside these finger jointed 2x4 poplars for the top and bottom tracks. And here is where we will begin today. All that was left for me to do at this point was to round over the edges of this track and put it on the wall. I used heavy-duty brackets to mount the track, and everything else was pretty straightforward. Find the stud, mount the bracket, voila. By the way, do you ever find yourself making funny faces when you're concentrating? Because mine here is glorious, and I can't be the only one who does stuff like this. After installing the bottom track, it's now time to make a top track. I used another finger jointed 2x4 poplar and made a dado cut with a router. This would have been faster if I'd used a table saw, but the outfeed table was really occupied with all the stuff that was sitting in front of the window. I didn't want to clean twice, so, you know, sometimes you just gotta work around things. I don't know if anyone noticed, but the top track is actually not the same length as the bottom track. Because the top track is mostly a guide for the board to stay straight, I only needed it to be a little longer than half of the bottom. So with the bottom at 9 feet long, I made the top 6 feet. Then, of course, mounting the top track was the same as how I mounted the bottom. Find the stud, screw it in, voila. The first time I slid the wall felt pretty awesome. It's that feeling of having waited forever for something specific to happen, and there it was, finally happening right in front of you, as you can see on my face. That satisfaction was priceless. Once I got the wall up and running, or in this case, sliding, I quickly moved on to the next step, making clamp holders. Just as a little backstory, I have been lurking Pinterest for about 4 to 5 years now about clamp organization. It's an odd feeling of satisfaction to see organized things, but I also consider it very necessary research. I've also worked with several different styles of clamp racks, and from what I found, having the clamps set on a shelf works much more better for me than hanging them up on a rack. Has anyone ever gotten hit by the sliding jaw in the middle of hanging them up? Yeah, I have. Too many times. Man, I hate it. I'm also not a big fan of clamps having a very specific spot. It looks cool, but I like grabbing multiple clamps at the same time, typically 3 to 4 of them, sometimes more if I'm feeling extra crazy. This shelf concept satisfies this impatience of mine, and dare I say it's more efficient? I'll go ahead and say yes it is. The shelf for these cabinet clamps is made of plywood. I had some white oak strips laying around and decided to glue them around the edges because they would protect the plywood layers from getting dinged, and they look nice. Once the shelf was done, I put it on the wall with these brackets on the top side and not the bottom. That way, it'll also act as a divider and kind of a half wall. Because the tendency of clamps is to fall, and in this case, sideways, I made these super simple bumpers. I got some 2x4s, flattened them, and then rounded the corners so that if I happen to be a little clumsy around that area, they won't be able to stab me. Once I put all the clamps on the shelf, I gave them a little oopsie test. And perfect! I did think a lot about a secondary method of fall prevention, but since I've created them, they've been behaving very nicely, so I went ahead and skipped it. I figured if it does truly fall a few times in the next upcoming month, then I'll work on creating a secondary method. But if I don't have to do it, I'll leave it as is. For my F-clamp storage, I decided on an open rectangle design so that I can simply hang them. A little bonus trick that this design lets me do is the closing of the jaws while I'm putting them back. While hooking it over the edge, I can actually use the edge itself to push the clutch, and like magic, it'll close up flawlessly. Smart, huh? If you follow my mini vlogs, you might remember seeing that I encountered a tiny problem after making the cabinet clamp shelf. Even though it looked really nice, I noticed that when all the weight of the clamps were loaded onto it, I started to feel uncertain about whether or not the wheels would be able to handle it. So I decided to switch them out with some heftier wheels. The new ones I got are for heavy appliances. Each wheel can handle 250 pounds, so after putting 8 of them on, that new capacity now comes to roughly 2,000 pounds. That should be enough, don't you think? In order to be able to put the new wheels on, I needed the base to be wider. So I got 2 strips of maple to sandwich the bottom of the wall. These strips of maple were in my potential pile for a long time. If I were to guess, I'd say about 3 years now. So finally getting to use them on a project like this was actually super satisfying. Kind of like a mix of, I knew it, and finally giving these pieces a home. The wheels had a threaded rod and a nut as a fastening system, so I wouldn't have been able to install this directly into the wall. My solution? Angle irons. I drilled a series of holes on both sides of the angle irons, one side to fasten the wheels and the other side to install directly into the base of the board. I drilled holes in the bottom of the base to make room for the nuts and rods, and after a quick test fitting, everything seemed to work perfectly. The last step before putting everything together was painting. Now, for the longest time, I've always wanted to have a splash of color in my woodshop. As much as I adore the natural color of wood, I do think that too much of it can make things a little dull. If someone were to ask if I'd ever like to live in a house where everything was made of wood, I'd say no. I want balance, a splash of color, a different element, something to add a little mix of spice and flavor. Take for example, brass and wood. What a fantastic and sexy combination. So with this wall mostly done already, the least that I could do is alter the color. At first, I went straight for it and began painting it its final color. But a few minutes after I got going, the thought of the color possibly not coming through raced through my mind. So I stopped it immediately and went back to apply primer. I can be pretty stubborn sometimes, but for something as important as this, I was able to snap myself out of it. And I'm glad I did, because look at this. The color came out so beautifully. After letting the paint fully dry, it was finally time for the assembly. Now, many people had suggestions for me while I made this wall, like making it a barn door wall or using rollerblade wheels, and all of these ideas were great. But the reason why I made it the way I did was because I really wanted to use the materials I already had on hand. That way, I wouldn't be spending too much money and I could get the job done. And I think it turned out pretty well. What do you think?